Welcome back to The Bible is Art, where we explore the literary artistry of the Bible. And this week, we are looking at the two main ways biblical authors organize their stories. Before we get to these two main ways, we have to talk about the simple and sort of straightforward way that stories are organized, and that is they're organized linearly. That is, they start at the beginning and they end at the end. That is, they follow sequence by sequence through chronologically to the end of the story. And that's 99% of stories inside and outside the Bible. And unless you're doing some crazy dischronologized narrative, some Christopher Nolan Memento stuff, then that's how it happens. And even when dischronologized, out of sequence stuff happens, normally it's just one scene or two. So most stories are linear. Now, if you are a great artist, a great narrative artist, you will do other things on top of telling a story in order linearly from beginning to end. You will do another layer of artistry on top. And in the Bible, there are two main kinds of literary organization that we're going to talk about. And that is, there is parallel and symmetrical literary structures. And the reason for doing this is because when you add on another layer of organization and design, you can communicate additional things about the thesis of the story, the main character, some of the themes, or whatever it is. It's just another level of depth. So let's look at these. And first, parallel. Now, parallel literary structures come in two flavors in the Bible. That is, there is paired and sequential parallel literary structures. Now, a paired literary structure is where you have two scenes that are paired, and then you'll have two more scenes that are paired, and then two more depending on how long the story is. So you'll have these couplets, and they have similarities and they have differences, but you're supposed to read them together. And so you read one story and then you read the next story, and you'll realize maybe it's a similar scene or a similar character or a similar sequence or something in the story that leads you to believe that, oh, these two things should be read together, should be compared together. And a beautiful example of this is the Joseph narrative, the climactic longest narrative in the book of Genesis. And here is how it looks. The narrative of Joseph unfolds in 14 sections, or 7 pairs, 7 doublets. And here's what happens. The first two scenes, you have trouble or conflict between Joseph and his brothers. Then you have two scenes where you have sexual temptation between Judah and someone and Joseph and someone. And you will see that Judah fails, but Joseph succeeds. Then you have two scenes of Joseph interpreting two dreams. Then you have brothers come to Egypt for food, etc., etc., etc. And it's just this wonderful, wonderful design of the narrative. That's parallel, paired literary structure. Now, the second kind of parallel structure is sequential. And here's how it goes. You'll have a number of scenes or episodes, say 3, 4, 5, that form a sequence, a pattern. And then that whole pattern will repeat. And the first thing in each of those will correspond in some way, and the second thing will correspond, etc., etc., etc. And a wonderful example of this is the entire book of Jonah. And here's how it goes. You have a sequence of 3 scenes that repeats twice. In the first episode in each of the sequences, you have Jonah being commissioned by God to go to the Ninevites. In the second scene, you'll have Jonah with some pagan counterpart, some pagan interlocutor. In the first sequence, it will be sailors. In the second sequence, it'll be the Ninevites. And then in the third scene, you'll have a prayer by Jonah. The first time round, it will be a grateful, thankful prayer to God. The second time around, it will be a resentful prayer. Now, the fascinating thing about the book of Jonah is that you have an additional literary feature called a false conclusion. And what a false conclusion is where the narrator will write the story in such a way to lead you to believe that the story is ended. So maybe he'll resolve many of the major themes, or there will be a sort of expected summing up of things. And then there will be an additional scene. Now, what's fascinating about this is 2 things. First of all, you just get more of the story. So you're already enraptured, interested in this story, and you get to know more about it. But more importantly is that the great genius use of a false conclusion is that a lot of times, and this is true in Jonah, is that in that final scene, you will get the heart of the story, the central theme, the central thesis, and it will lead you to all of a sudden reconsider what the book was actually about. And that's true in Jonah. You have a final climactic scene where God orchestrates a parable for Jonah. We don't have time to talk about it now. I wish we did some other time. But we have our last literary structure to talk about, and that is the symmetrical literary structure. This is also called a chiasm or a chiastic structure. And here is how it looks. It's kind of like the parallel sequential one, but the second half is flipped around. And what happens in this structure is that you have the first and the last scenes or sections that correspond somehow, then the second and the second to the last, all the way down to the center of the story. And in the center of the story, you'll have this central focus scene, or sometimes it's 2 scenes back to back. And what will happen in the central point is typically it will be either an emphasis or a turning point or both of the story. Now, a great example of this is the Abraham narrative. And here is how it looks. The Abraham story begins and ends with God calling Abraham to do something. It's the only time in the Abraham story where this verb is used, where God calls Abraham to do something. It's very striking, a book ending of this story. You move one in and you have an episode where Abraham's wife gets attacked by someone. Then you move one in and you have a situation with Lot and Abraham, where Abraham has to rescue Lot. And you keep moving in, you get to the covenants at close to the center of the story, but it's actually, interestingly, the covenant with Abraham is not the center. You have at the center, an episode with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And here is the fall of Abraham. That is to say, this promise of children and kingdom and all these things that God has promised, he doesn't have patience. And with echoes of that original primal sin of Genesis 3 and Adam and Eve in the garden, it says that it shows us that Abraham listens to the voice of his wife, and he takes this thing, he knows this woman. So in both of these clear allusions back to that original sin that has to do with knowledge. Here it means sexual knowledge, not in the garden so much, and a listening to the voice of the wife instead of the voice of God. But fascinatingly, so that's what happens in the first part of this central section of the Abraham story. But you also have another part of this central scene, and that's a story about Hagar, Abraham's foreign wife, and she goes off into the wilderness, and God comes and cares for her there, and I would love to talk about it, but I can't at this point. So that's the organization of the Abraham narrative, and that's the two main ways biblical authors organize, design their stories. And now we are prepared to understand the design of Genesis chapter 1.